April 18th, 1961. The White House, Washington, D.C. The day is gray and unsettled, the kind of spring morning that refuses to warm. Inside the Oval Office, John Fitzgerald Kennedy sits at his desk, only 87 days into his presidency. Overnight reports lie open in front of him. The invasion of Cuba, meant to be deniable, swift, and decisive, is unraveling by the hour. What Kennedy says next, and to whom, will shape the rest of his presidency. The plan had not begun here. It began years earlier, under the Eisenhower administration, in CIA conference rooms and Caribbean safe houses. The concept was simple in outline and deeply fragile in execution. Train a force of Cuban exiles, land them on the island, trigger an uprising, and remove Fidel Castro without direct American fingerprints. The landing site, Bahia de Cochinos, the Bay of Pigs, was remote, swampy, and ringed by coral reefs. It was chosen for secrecy, not flexibility. By April 17, 1961, Brigade 2506, about 1,400 men, had gone ashore. Almost immediately, things went wrong. The element of surprise collapsed. Cuban government aircraft, far from being neutralized, were still flying. Supply ships were hit. Radio messages from the beach grew desperate and confused. Kennedy followed the reports from Washington, receiving updates measured in minutes and miles. He knew the distances involved. 90 miles from Florida to Cuba, too close for comfort, too close for escalation to be invisible. Each decision now carried weight beyond the battlefield. He refused one option outright: no U.S. Marines, no open American air cover. By April 18th, the invasion was effectively doomed. Cuban forces, tanks, artillery, and infantry loyal to Castro closed in. The exiles were pinned between the sea and the swamps, with little room to maneuver and no realistic path of retreat. Ammunition ran low. Radios failed. The final airstrikes that might have slowed the Cuban advance were canceled, a decision Kennedy approved after intense debate. That night, Kennedy did not sleep much. The next day, April 19th, the fighting ended. Survivors were captured. Over 100 men lay dead. The rest would spend months in Cuban prisons before being ransomed with food and medical supplies. Publicly, the president moved quickly. On April 20th, Kennedy addressed the press. He did not hide from responsibility. "Victory has 100 fathers," he said, "and defeat is an orphan." He stated clearly that as president, the burden of failure rested on him alone. But behind closed doors, the language changed. In the days that followed, Kennedy met with his advisors in small tense sessions. The tone was controlled, but the disappointment was unmistakable. He asked for timelines, for exact decisions, for who had assumed what at each stage. He wanted to know why he had been told the Cuban people would rise, why intelligence estimates dismissed Castro's Air Force as negligible, why dissenting voices inside the administration had been muted or ignored. The answers were unsatisfying. The CIA, particularly its senior leadership, came under intense scrutiny. Kennedy felt he had been boxed in, presented with a plan that appeared already in motion, framed as inherited and nearly inevitable. The concept of plausible deniability angered him most. He understood now that it was a fiction. The world had no doubt who stood behind the invasion. Privately, Kennedy was blunt. He told aides that the CIA had oversold its assumptions and underestimated the enemy. He was disturbed by what he saw as institutional momentum, plans advancing not because they were sound, but because they already existed. At one point, Kennedy confided to a close advisor that he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. It was not a threat, but a measure of his frustration. He had trusted expertise. He had learned how fragile it could be. Yet Kennedy did not spare himself. He recognized his own role, approving a plan he did not fully believe in, resisting escalation while hoping for success, trying to balance secrecy with restraint. The failure forced a reckoning with the limits of control in modern warfare, where decisions made in quiet rooms could collapse under real terrain, real weather, and real resistance. The consequences were immediate. Within months, CIA Director Allen Dulles would leave his post. So would his deputies. Kennedy reorganized how intelligence was presented to the White House. He demanded clearer dissent, sharper risk assessments, and an end to what he saw as optimistic filtering. The Bay of Pigs also hardened Kennedy's view of Fidel Castro in the Soviet Union. He became more skeptical, more cautious, but also more determined not to be cornered again. That resolve would surface a year later during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Kennedy insisted on hearing every option and every objection before choosing a path. But in April 1961, that future was still unknown.